huge FHIR proponent. I'm really excited to get to use it to bring together disparate data sources. And we're going to talk about some of the challenges that you have when you try to do that to enable whole person care. When we're talking about whole person care, that's things like care management, care coordination, trying to bring together a whole picture for the patient through FHIR, through these different data points that you're able to access now that these various regulations have gone into play. So first roadblocks to achieving what I call the last mile. Last mile is when we think about FHIR, we're now able to access all this data, all this huge data set across a variety of different systems. We have the piping, we have the delivery mechanism, but we need to start to make sense of that data. Now, one of the first roadblocks to think about is that providers, when you send this data to them, they drown in it. If you were to bring every allergy resource, every tiny little bit of allergy information from various sources of data, from your EHRs, from payer data, through those new FHIR pipelines, they're not going to know what to make of it. There's no intelligent deduplication. There's no inherent logic that's in FHIR to be able to process that down. So that's one of the first roadblocks you need to consider when you're thinking about enabling those whole person use cases. The second one is thinking about data governance, thinking about how you can apply some kind of governance to the semantics of the data so that you're curating that information in such a way that it's aligned with what you're trying to enable. A specific example of that would be something like a problem list. Problem list can be explained in ICD codes and SNOMED codes, IMO codes, a variety of other code sets. What is the actual use case that you're trying to enable? And you want to align all the content that you're piping through those FHIR pipes with that use case. So you need to think about either the endpoints or the streaming heads and aligning the semantics with that. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a second. The next big one is thinking about incentives. Incentives are important to think about with FHIR. Now, when we are, again, transmitting that data, what is the end use case that you're trying to enable? Is it you're trying to get the provider to acknowledge some kind of condition? Are you trying to get the provider to take action on an order? You need to think about what are the incentives that are pushing the provider to change their minds, pushing them to change their behaviors, and how that aligns with the different care models. Lastly, think about data access. FHIR inherently has scopes that allow you to control through Smart on FHIR access to specific resources, but it doesn't tell you which patients the doctor should have access to. It doesn't tell you at a lower level of detail what information they should have access to. So that usually has to come into play with a third-party system to control that, to constrain it down. So when we think about interoperability in FHIR, today we're still pretty misaligned between incentives. We're kind of still in this fragmented state where FHIR endpoints are just sending a whole swath of data. They're just streaming all this information out, but it's not actually aligned with what that end use case is. And we need to push for a more comprehensive data fabric, a more well-designed, well-aligned solution with the teams and the use cases that we're trying to push. So when we think about compliance, again, with all these regulations, with all these rules that are coming out, they are enabling the pipeline. They are enabling FHIR. So today, your EHRs have to support Smart on FHIR. They have to support US CDI V1. And that has a really great set of resources, a really great set of data that enables the provider or the payer or anybody to access that information. But compliance alone doesn't actually give you the full power of that data set. Again, it's just giving you access to the data. It doesn't necessarily derive meaning from it. It doesn't deduplicate the data. So that's one thing to consider. Next is thinking about adoption. FHIR is pushing for read-only APIs. So as it exists today, it's a great way to get data out of an EHR. It's a great way to get data out of a system, out of a compliance system. But the write back, the ability for information to flow back into a system is still kind of being adopted. There are folks like Epic that have a great set of write back FHIR APIs, but that's still coming together through the industry. When we're talking about whole person care, that does require not just alignment from a technical perspective, but alignment from a clinical perspective as well. Going back to that example about allergies, do your clinicians really care about allergies as much as they care about problems? How much effort, how much attention do you want to spend to each resource to be able to deduplicate it, to apply data governance, to bring that data together? Next is thinking about accountability. As we bring together this data and it just is this diaspora of information, it can actually erode trust if you're just shooting that to the provider at the end point of care, and actually cause accountability issues. So that's something to be considerate of as you kind of bring together these different projects. And then lastly, a lot of these projects that are out there right now with bringing together FHIR with different applications, different data sets, are getting derailed at the last mile because they're not thinking about that full stack. They're just thinking about one specific piece of tech, or they're just thinking about one specific use case, and you really need to bring it all together. One of my favorite examples is thinking about blood pressure. So just because you can emit data through FHIR doesn't necessarily mean that you're deriving meaning from that data. Blood pressure is this really good example of a data point that requires a large set of data around it to make meaning of it. Just saying that the patient had blood pressure of 120/80 is not sufficient. You need to know how that data was collected. You need to know if it was collected from the patient on some like wristband. You need to know if it was collected within a clinical setting. You need to know kind of the timing of that collection to actually drive any kind of meaning from that data point. So again, FHIR enables us to access all this data, to flow data. But you have to contextualize it. You have to have information around it to provide meaning. The next thing to think about is that with something like blood pressure, there's many different codes that can map to this particular data point. So if you just target some of the typical codes, you may be excluding more specific codes that certain systems may be emitting. So if the patient happens to have the data collected in a very standardized workflow, you're going to get the right LOINC code. But if like some biometric system, some other downstream system is capturing that data in a more specific way or more abstract way, you need to have a system, a terminology service in your infrastructure, in your solution, to be able to map it to the right code and to a code that can aggregate correctly. Next point is that providers really need to trust that data. Again, to that comment about surrounding information, if the provider isn't able to see the surrounding information about that data point, they're not going to trust it. They don't know how to interpret it. They don't know whether or not that's a real piece of data or not. So you need to be considerate to that. And again, consider the source. With, again, FHIR opening up all these pipelines, you can accidentally take in a bunch of data that may not be sourced correctly, that may not be clinically accurate, that may not have been vetted or reconciled appropriately. And then last, think about the standards. Even within the standards, there's a number of different data points for blood pressure specifically. As you work through your data governance and your mapping, you need to consider how that information is being mapped. So as you're thinking about your integration strategy with FHIR, really encourage you to be outcome oriented, to think about what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve, what are the use cases you're trying to achieve. Just saying you have FHIR, just opening up the pipes is not going to get you very far. You need to think about what are the end use cases, what is the change you're trying to enable, and build backwards from that. Think about meeting the users where they are, being complementary to kind of the various initiatives that you have and what you're trying to plug into. And then think about building flexibility in these models and the data that you have so that you're future-proofing your work. So it's a pretty quick talk, but does anybody have questions about FHIR or whole person care? So the question was, what happens when you lose trust? What happens when the provider is looking at the data and for some reason they distrust it and they check out of the system? So something that's very common is when you're working on these pilots, when you're working on these projects, you're going to have a provider look at a recommendation for a problem. You're going to have somebody look at an allergy that you're asking them to reconcile, and it looks like garbage, and they're going to check out. So number one recommendation for that, get everybody possible to validate the data before the provider sees it. If the provider is the first person you're asking to validate your data, they're the first person you're asking to look at the information or the integration, you've already lost. You've lost their trust, you've lost their confidence. Their time is ultra precious, and you can't take advantage of it. So think about ways that you can do a sanity check on the data. Think about aggregation, deduplication. With terminology services, you should be able to identify duplication within your data sets and work on that as one of your primary efforts before you actually ship the data to the provider. Do base sanity checks on the data before it gets to them. So the question was, FHIR is mature in read APIs, but not mature in write APIs. How big of a challenge is that? So one of the reasons that FHIR is not mature in write capabilities is that the semantics of FHIR are still not hardened. So for blood pressure, we can take whatever the system sends us, right? Whatever LOINC code, whatever SNOMED code, whatever they want to send us. They don't have to care about curating that or sending it down to one particular code unless they're compliant to a particular profile. With write capabilities, you really have to agree to the right semantics of the data, and that can be a challenge. So for certain data points, that's more evolved. Blood pressure vitals is a good example of something that's fairly evolved. But once you start going far afield into other kinds of biometrics or other observations, you can be pretty challenged with that. So appropriately, a lot of vendors are choosing not to open up the write APIs just quite yet, or controlling which resources they're developing for that. So conditions, problems is a pretty good example of something that is on the more mature scale of a write API, because that's just a more standard code set, ICD, SNOMED codes. So it's a more reliable payload that you're sending back into the system versus something like documents, which can get a little bit sketchy, or even allergies, meds, orders can have very unreliable code set versions. So we'll see that evolve over time. But right now it's still kind of in the maturing phase. The challenge of data consistency is not unique to FHIR. That every EHR, every data source chooses its own data set, its own code set to map to on the back end. And that variance is only kind of surfaced by FHIR, by the fact that FHIR is opening up these pipelines, opening up these data points for access. So FHIR itself is not introducing data inconsistency, but it's surfacing a lot of data inconsistency that's already there, which is good. It's forcing us to have these kinds of conversations and forcing the organizations to think about data governance to correct the data and to work on data mapping. But it doesn't intrinsically solve that challenge. Great. Thank you, everybody.